Two rookie police officers thought they were in control when they stopped and racially humiliated a plus-sized black woman in expensive attire. They mocked her, questioned her presence, and treated her with utter disrespect, unaware that she was a highly influential senator. What started as a routine abuse of power quickly spiraled into a career-ending disaster as cameras rolled and the truth spread like wildfire. By the next day, their actions led to national outrage, swift consequences, and a reckoning they never saw coming. Watch the full story unfold, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Regina Wallace stepped out of the boutique, her arms full of shopping bags, the weight of the day still clinging to her shoulders. Her mind buzzed with the endless battles fought in the Senate chambers, the policies debated, the systemic injustices she worked tirelessly to correct. She barely had time to register the sound of sirens before flashing lights filled her vision. The instinctive heaviness settled in her chest before she even turned around. Across the street, two rookie officers observed her movements with scrutinizing eyes, their minds already made up. She fit the profile they had been conditioned to suspect: her confidence, her attire, her very presence triggering something unspoken in them. They watched her reach for her car door and decided this was the moment to assert their authority. A sharp command cut through the air, stopping her cold. Her fingers stiffened around the handle of her car as her brain worked through the situation at lightning speed. There was no mistake, she was being profiled. Again. Her pulse steadied, her breath remained measured, but inside, a storm brewed. She turned slowly, meeting their gaze, her features unreadable. She had spent years in legislative battles trying to prevent moments like this, yet here she was, standing in the center of it. The officers approached, one resting a hand near his holster, the other stepping forward with the entitled confidence of someone who had never been questioned. They didn't see a senator, they saw a black woman in expensive clothes. The tension in the air thickened as they demanded identification, throwing in vague claims of fraud reports in the area. She knew the script well. She had seen this play out in courtrooms, in committee hearings, in the statistics that fueled her policy reforms. It never changed. Her voice remained calm, controlled, but each word she spoke only fueled their growing irritation. She watched their jaws tighten, their fingers twitch, their patience thinning at her refusal to comply without reason. The air crackled with the weight of unspoken truths. The bystanders who had begun to gather sensed it too. Phones were raised, recording the moment that had played out too many times before. The taller officer moved closer, his presence an attempt to intimidate. She did not back down. They mistook her steadiness for defiance. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from the sheer exhaustion of it all. The officer reached for her arm. Before his fingers could brush against her, a new voice cut through the air, freezing him in place. A figure emerged from an unmarked vehicle, his face unreadable, but his authority unmistakable. The weight of his presence shifted the energy instantly. The officers stiffened, their arrogance flickering into unease. They had made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. The woman they had tried to subdue was not just another target. She was power incarnate, and now, their reckoning had arrived. The weight of realization crashed down on the officers in an instant. They had thought they were in control, that their authority was absolute. But now, standing under the harsh scrutiny of their superior, the reality of their actions became unavoidable. Their arrogance faltered, their confidence cracked. The shift in power was swift, brutal, and irreversible. Regina Wallace remained still, her breath steady, her pulse slow. She had learned long ago that battles were won not through loud resistance, but through unwavering resolve. She watched the two men scramble for words, excuses forming but dying before they could be spoken. The man who had stepped between them, the police chief himself, did not need to say much. His presence alone was enough to seal their fate. The officer who had been closest to grabbing her arm stiffened, his fingers curling into a tense fist at his side. His thoughts ran wild. How had this gone so wrong, so quickly? He had expected compliance, submission, maybe even fear. Instead, he was met with someone who had no intention of yielding, someone who held more power than he had anticipated. His stomach churned as he pieced together the implications. He had underestimated her. And now, he would pay for it. The police chief's voice cut through the silence like a blade, laced with a kind of authority that left no room for defiance. The demand for an explanation was met with stammered justifications, weak attempts to defend their actions. But the weight of their miscalculation bore down on them, suffocating, undeniable. Regina said nothing. She let them flail, let them reveal their incompetence through their own desperation. The longer they spoke, the deeper they buried themselves. The growing crowd only fueled the tension, their silent judgment pressing in on all sides. Phones recorded every second, ensuring that whatever happened next would not be forgotten. The officer with the holster habit clenched his jaw. He had been so sure, so certain that his actions were justified. But there was no escaping this. He felt the tide turn against him, the certainty of his authority eroding beneath him. He stole a glance at his partner, who stood rigid, eyes darting between their superior and the woman who had just appended their entire night. The police chief's decision was swift. The reprimand was public, sharp, and absolute. The officers were ordered to stand down, their badges temporarily confiscated pending an internal review. They were escorted back to their patrol car, their steps heavier than before, weighed down by the realization that this night would follow them forever. Regina exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest lifting, but only slightly. This was not the first time she had faced injustice, nor would it be the last. But today, she had won. And tomorrow, she would ensure that no one else had to fight this battle alone. She turned, lifting her chin as she stepped away, knowing full well that the battle was only beginning. The department's internal affairs unit was activated within hours, launching a full investigation into the officers' conduct. Word spread quickly, and other officers who had worked alongside them began whispering, some distancing themselves while others defended their actions. The division within the force grew deeper, as some officers saw this as a reckoning, while others viewed it as an overreaction. News of the incident reached the media before the police department could control the narrative. By morning, headlines had already painted the officers as aggressors and Regina as an emblem of resilience against systemic abuse. Social media erupted with support for Regina, demanding accountability and immediate action against the officers involved. One of the officers, unable to handle the fallout, sought legal counsel and attempted to negotiate a deal. He claimed that they were following orders from higher up, hinting at a broader culture of racial profiling within the department. This revelation threatened to expose corruption at levels no one had anticipated. Regina's political allies began to mobilize, using the incident to push for stronger law enforcement oversight. She was invited to speak at several events addressing racial bias in policing, her presence now symbolizing more than just her own experience. It was a rallying call for change. The officers' disciplinary hearing was set within the week, but tensions inside the department continued to rise. Some officers resented the investigation, while others feared they would be next. The battle had shifted from the streets to the internal power struggles within the police force, and the true fight for accountability was just beginning. The fallout from the night's events spread through the department like wildfire. Within hours, the precinct was divided. Some officers maintained that the rookies had only been doing their job, while others saw the incident for what it was: a reckless display of prejudice that had dragged the entire force into the public spotlight. Tension built in the hallways, silent stares exchanged between officers who now found themselves on opposing sides of an issue that had long simmered beneath the surface. Regina Wallace sat in her office, watching the media storm unfold. The video had gone viral, and the pressure on the department to act was mounting. Her phone had not stopped ringing calls from journalists, allies, and political opponents alike. She knew that how she handled the next 48 hours would determine whether this moment led to real change or faded into another forgotten controversy. Her fingers hovered over her phone before she made the call to her legal team. This was no longer about her, it was about every person who had ever been in her position and been ignored. The two rookie officers, Brad Hayes and Kyle Monroe, sat in a holding room at the precinct, their badges confiscated pending investigation. Monroe was seething, pacing the floor, his mind scrambling for a way out of this mess. He blamed everyone but himself: Regina, the bystanders who had filmed them, the police chief who had humiliated them. Hayes, on the other hand, sat motionless, the weight of reality sinking in. He had grown up idolizing law enforcement, believing in its integrity, but now he was beginning to realize just how easily the shield of power could be turned against them. The police chief convened an emergency meeting with city officials. The mayor had called personally, making it clear that this incident had escalated beyond local control. There were talks of an independent oversight committee stepping in, federal agencies looking into the force's history of racial bias complaints. The chief knew this was bad. He had seen officers go down before, but never this fast, never this publicly. He needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall before the entire department was dismantled from the inside. Darren Collins, a veteran officer, sat in the back of the meeting room, watching the discussion unfold. He had seen too many of these conversations, where the goal wasn't accountability but containment. He knew how this would play out. Low-level officers like Hayes and Monroe would be sacrificed while the real architects of corruption remained untouched. He leaned back in his chair, debating whether to finally speak up. He had kept his head down for years, but maybe this was the moment to break his silence. Regina's legal team worked through the night, compiling every documented case of racial profiling in the department over the last 5 years. They prepared lawsuits, drafted press statements, and arranged for her to meet with key civil rights organizations. This wasn't just about pressing charges against 2 officers. This was about dismantling a culture of unchecked power. Monroe's lawyer advised him to stay quiet, to let the department handle things internally, but he couldn't accept that. He wanted control back. That night, he reached out to an old connection, someone who knew how to make problems disappear. He wasn't going down alone, and if he had to dig up dirt on the force to protect himself, he would do it. Hayes, on the other hand, lay awake in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. His world had shattered in less than 24 hours. He had thought he was enforcing the law, but now he wasn't so sure. Every interaction he had ever had as an officer replayed in his mind. How many times had he ignored his gut instinct? How many times had he let his partner lead while he followed blindly? His phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. "If you talk, you'll regret it." His hands shook as he put the phone down. He knew then that he had a choice to make. The morning came with more headlines, more protests, and more pressure. The city was watching, waiting to see who would be held accountable. Regina stepped up to the podium, cameras flashing, and began to speak. The battle for justice was far from over, but she had no intention of backing down. This was just the beginning. The investigation into the department's racial profiling practices had reached a boiling point. Regina Wallace's legal team had filed multiple lawsuits, and the city was now under immense pressure to respond. The police union scrambled to control the damage, issuing statements that attempted to frame Hayes and Monroe as isolated cases rather than symptoms of a larger issue. But the evidence continued to pile up. Officers, both past and present, started coming forward with their own stories, some out of guilt, others out of self-preservation. Inside the precinct, tension suffocated every conversation. Some officers doubled down, refusing to acknowledge the depth of the corruption, while others quietly packed their desks, sensing the inevitable purge that was coming. Darren Collins had seen departments collapse under scandals before, but this was different. This was happening in real time, and he was caught in the middle. He had received threats since testifying against Hayes and Monroe, his reputation among his peers shattered. But he knew the truth was out now. There was no going back. Hayes sat in a conference room with his attorney, staring at the folder filled with potential plea agreements. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. He had been advised to take a deal to testify against Monroe, against his supervisors, against anyone who could shift the focus away from him. But his loyalty, or perhaps his fear, kept him from signing. The people he had once trusted had already abandoned him, and if he spoke now, there would be no safety left for him. Monroe, on the other hand, was unraveling. He had spent the last week consumed by paranoia, convinced that he was being followed, that his phone was being tapped. He knew how this worked. The moment he stopped being useful, he would be discarded. He made desperate phone calls, trying to leverage whatever influence he had left. But the answers were always the same: no one could help him. He was on his own. At City Hall, the mayor was running out of options. His advisors urged him to take a hard stance, to push for policy changes that would appease the public while preserving what power they still had. But the protests outside were relentless, and the national media had turned its attention to the scandal. It was no longer just about two rookie cops making a mistake, it was about the entire institution that had allowed them to operate unchecked. And that was not something that could be fixed with a press release. Regina Wallace prepared for the next stage of the fight. She knew how this game was played. There would be attempts to discredit her, to paint her as an opportunist using this case for political gain. But she had something more powerful than their smear tactics, she had the truth. And with the growing number of officers willing to testify, she was getting closer to dismantling the very system that had tried to silence her. The night before the official hearing, an anonymous whistleblower delivered a set of documents to Rachel Monroe's newsroom. The files contained detailed records of falsified reports, excessive force complaints that had been buried, and direct communications from higher-ups instructing officers to target specific demographics. This was the final piece, the proof that the corruption extended beyond just a few bad cops. The moment Rachel opened the files, she knew the department was finished. The following morning, the city held its breath as the disciplinary hearings began. Officers lined the hallways of the precinct, waiting to see who would be the first to fall. Some clung to the hope that they could ride out the storm, while others knew that their careers, and possibly their freedom, were about to be stripped away. Hayes and Monroe were brought in separately, each facing their own reckoning. Monroe, still clinging to defiance, refused to speak. Hayes, after a long pause, finally broke his silence. The moment he started naming names, the dam burst. Regina watched from the front row as the system she had spent her life fighting against finally cracked under its own weight. This was far from over, but for the first time, she could see the path forward. The department would fall. The city would change. And no one would forget the night two officers thought they could profile the wrong woman. The police chief, realizing the storm had become unmanageable, called an emergency meeting with top brass. Internal memos had already surfaced, implicating several high-ranking officials in cover-ups spanning years. The department was hemorrhaging credibility, and drastic measures had to be taken to prevent a complete collapse. A faction of officers still loyal to Monroe attempted to stage a counter-narrative, claiming the entire situation had been exaggerated by the media. They leaked fabricated reports, suggesting that Regina had provoked the encounter. But the public had already seen the footage, and the attempt to rewrite history only deepened the distrust toward the force. An anonymous tip led to the discovery of an off-the-books operation within the department that had been systematically targeting black and minority communities under the guise of routine stops. The revelation sent shockwaves through City Hall, prompting federal agencies to announce their involvement in the investigation. Hayes, fearing for his safety after turning on his peers, was placed in protective custody. His testimony had implicated several senior officers, making him a prime target for retaliation. His lawyer negotiated a deal that would allow him to disappear under witness protection once the trials were over. Monroe, desperate to avoid what now seemed like an inevitable conviction, attempted to flee the city under a false identity. His plan fell apart when federal agents intercepted him at a private airstrip, arresting him on additional charges of obstruction and conspiracy. Regina, after months of relentless pursuit for justice, stood before the cameras at a press conference. Her voice was steady, her resolve unshaken. She outlined a vision for reform, demanding accountability not just for this case but for every victim who had suffered under the unchecked power of corrupt officers. This was no longer just about her, it was about dismantling a system that had allowed injustice to thrive for far too long. The tension within the city reached its peak as the disciplinary hearings moved forward. The case had expanded beyond two rookie officers. It had become a full-scale investigation into systemic corruption, abuse of power, and racial profiling that had plagued the department for years. Regina Wallace watched from her office, reviewing every new development. The battle was shifting from the streets to the legal system, and she was prepared for the next phase. Hayes, now under protective custody, struggled with the weight of his testimony. He had exposed Monroe and several senior officers, placing himself at the center of the storm. His former colleagues viewed him as a traitor, while the public saw him as a necessary informant. His anxiety grew each day as the reality of retaliation loomed. He knew that once the trials began, he would never be safe again. Monroe sat in a cold interrogation room, his hands shackled to the table. His arrogance had faded, replaced with the realization that no one was coming to save him. His attempt to flee had only worsened his situation. Federal agents had taken over his case, and the weight of the charges against him ensured that he would never wear a badge again. His lawyer advised him to cooperate, but he refused. He still believed he could manipulate the system in his favor. The police chief faced mounting pressure from both the public and internal forces within the department. Officers loyal to Monroe were growing restless, fearing that they would be next. The chief had made backdoor deals for years, but now, the walls were closing in. The mayor's office had given him an ultimatum: clean house or step down. The decision weighed heavily on him, knowing that any move he made would result in irreversible consequences. Darren Collins continued to navigate the department's hostility. He had survived multiple threats, but his position within the force had become untenable. His decision to testify had placed a target on his back. Each day, he questioned whether staying was worth it. He had always believed in justice, but now, he wasn't sure if the institution he served could ever be redeemed. Rachel Monroe's investigative team published another report, this time exposing financial records that linked senior officers to bribes and illegal operations. The implications were staggering. The corruption extended far beyond what had been initially suspected. The city erupted with demands for immediate resignations, and federal agents expanded their investigation. The department was unraveling at an uncontrollable pace. The hearings became the focal point of national attention. Regina, alongside her legal team, presented case after case of racial profiling, proving a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored for years. She dismantled the department's defenses, piece by piece, ensuring that no one could deny the truth any longer. Public opinion had shifted entirely. This was no longer about just two officers. It was about dismantling an entire system of abuse. The mayor, recognizing the inevitable, made the difficult decision to demand the resignation of the police chief. It was a desperate attempt to stabilize the situation, but it was too late. The entire department was now under federal oversight, with multiple officers facing immediate dismissal and potential prosecution. Monroe, realizing he had no allies left, finally broke. He confessed to everything: every false report, every unlawful stop, every order that had come from higher up. His testimony ensured that those who had protected him for years would now stand trial alongside him. But even as he spoke, he knew that nothing he said would change his fate. The city braced for the next chapter. The trials were set, the evidence was overwhelming, and the battle for accountability was nearing its climax. Regina stood at the forefront, knowing that the fight was far from over. The system had resisted change for too long, but now, it had no choice but to face the consequences of its actions. The city was in chaos. The police department, once an impenetrable institution, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Investigations had expanded beyond individual officers. Entire divisions were being audited, past cases reopened, and suspensions handed down in waves. The command structure was in disarray, with senior officers scrambling to save themselves from being implicated. Every conversation behind closed doors was laced with paranoia, alliances breaking apart as the pressure mounted. Regina Wallace stood firm in the center of the storm, unshaken by the threats, the media frenzy, and the political maneuvering happening behind the scenes. Her presence had become more than symbolic. She was the force pushing for change in a system that had resisted it for too long. Every day, new evidence surfaced, each revelation exposing another layer of misconduct. The people who had dismissed her as an opportunist were now scrambling to contain the consequences of their inaction. Inside the precinct, Darren Collins had reached his breaking point. His career in law enforcement was effectively over, but he was determined to take down as many corrupt officers as possible before he walked away. He had spent weeks compiling internal records, documenting every case he knew had been tampered with. He knew that once the full truth came out, many of his former colleagues would face prosecution, and some would never wear a badge again. Brad Hayes remained under protective custody, his testimony the linchpin in the unfolding trials. He had resigned himself to the fact that his life as a police officer was over. He had betrayed a system that once protected him, and now, he was a man with no allies. But as he listened to the recordings being played in the courtroom, detailing the orders he and Monroe had been given, he realized just how deep the rot ran. He had always believed he was following protocol, but now, He understood he had been nothing more than a pawn in a corrupt game. Kyle Monroe sat in his cell, his arrogance shattered. The confidence he once carried had been replaced with fear. He had no control anymore, no leverage, no one left to protect him. The people who had promised to have his back were nowhere to be found. His lawyer had advised him to take a plea deal, but Monroe refused to go down alone. He had names, he had information, and he was ready to use it. The police chief, watching everything collapse around him, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He called an emergency meeting with city officials, proposing sweeping reforms in an attempt to placate the public. But it was too late. The mayor had already distanced himself from the department's leadership, preparing to announce a complete overhaul of law enforcement policies. The chief realized, in that moment, that he had lost. His resignation was no longer a choice, it was an inevitability. Rachel Monroe's investigative reports had exposed everything. Her newsroom had released confidential emails, internal memos, and direct orders proving a long-standing pattern of racial profiling and cover-ups. The national news had picked up the story, and federal agencies were now involved. The department's fall was no longer a local issue, it was a national reckoning. Protests flooded the streets, louder and more determined than ever. The people demanded resignations, prosecutions, and justice for every victim who had suffered under the unchecked power of the police. The community had reached its breaking point, and there was no turning back. Regina knew this was the moment she had been fighting for, not just accountability, but lasting change. As the trials loomed closer, the final pieces fell into place. More officers flipped, turning over evidence to save themselves. Monroe's attempt to negotiate a lighter sentence led to the exposure of a network of higher-ups who had orchestrated years of misconduct. Regina, standing before the cameras, declared that this was only the beginning. The system had cracked open, and now she was going to make sure it never closed again. The final day of reckoning had arrived. The courtroom was packed, the weight of the trials pressing down on every individual involved. Regina Wallace sat at the front, her eyes unwavering as the final verdicts were about to be read. The city had been through weeks of upheaval, and now, justice would be served in a way that would be remembered for generations. Monroe sat stiffly in his seat, shackled, his arrogance replaced with dread. He had tried every possible way to escape the inevitable, but the system he once used to his advantage had now turned against him. His testimony had helped bring down higher-ranking officials, but it hadn't been enough to spare him. His fate was sealed. Hayes, still under protective custody, had accepted that his life as he knew it was over. His cooperation had been crucial in exposing the deeply entrenched corruption, but it had also made him a target. He watched as the judge read aloud the charges, his breath held as the gavel came down. The sentence was severe. The room erupted in murmurs, but there was no sympathy left for him. The police chief, forced to resign in disgrace, sat in silence as the city council announced sweeping reforms that stripped the department of unchecked power. He had spent decades ensuring that men like Monroe thrived under his watch, but now he was powerless to stop the tide. His legacy, once built on control and secrecy, had been shattered beyond repair. Rachel Monroe stood outside the courthouse, delivering live updates to the nation. The scandal had exposed the rot within the justice system, but it had also ignited a movement. Her reports had fueled the protests, demanded action, and refused to let those responsible slip through the cracks. She had been threatened, intimidated, and followed, but she had never backed down. This was the moment where truth had prevailed over deception. Darren Collins turned in his badge, his decision final. He had fought for justice from within, but he knew his time in law enforcement was over. He had done what he could, but the department was beyond saving in its current form. As he walked away, he felt the burden lift. He was no longer bound by an institution that had lost its way. Regina took the podium, facing the sea of reporters and supporters gathered outside. The battle had been long, the cost high, but today they had won. The officers who had abused their power were behind bars, the system that had protected them was being dismantled, and the voices of those who had been ignored for too long were finally being heard. But she knew this was not the end. This was just the beginning of a larger fight, one that would require vigilance, persistence, and the unyielding belief that justice was not a privilege, but a right. As the sun set over the city, change had already begun to take root. The trials had concluded, but the work was far from over. Regina, Rachel, and Collins knew that the fight against injustice would never truly end, but for now, they had won a battle that had once seemed impossible. And that victory was enough to keep them pushing forward into the future.